Because remember, when you first start off as on the path of economic development, what is your most important thing that you really need? Is to create jobs for your own people. And when you want to create jobs for your own people, you start with anything, whether it's services, whether it's agriculture, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's factories. Get your all the jobs for your people, and then arising from that, move up the whole value chain.
You are a young country in the sense, I mean, I'm not talking about ancient Egypt, I'm talking about in terms of population. And I think one thing that for Denmark has been so important is that you have a well-educated population, basically. Yeah? So I think that putting emphasis on your, primary, secondary, tertiary education is really, really important for the development here in Egypt.
One has to recognize that population is not a problem, but it can be an asset. An asset can be, because it depends on what you make of that population. So are we going to have 1.25 billion people who are unable to realize their dreams? Or are you going to have a country of 1.25 billion that will dream and aspire further and be empowered to do that? And so once you make that transition, then I think the building blocks of a policy framework can emerge.
The market size. I mean, for an African investor not to be in Egypt, you are missing the point. Just the market size, the sheer size. I mean, in South Africa, we're about 50 million people. And Egypt is about 100 now. Now, if you want to expand and be a continental power, continental company, you have to look at Egypt.
Singapore, see, if you look at the Global Competitiveness Index, whether you are small or whether you are big, there are three things that really stand out for global competitiveness. Singapore, Switzerland, Finland, Germany, US. Number one is education. Number two, it's public sector. And number three, it's macroeconomic stability and so on. So it actually cuts across. I don't subscribe to this philosophy that because you are small, you can be successful. I think the same principles apply to both big economies and small economies.
Yes, let me first add, we often talked about small countries. I think the three countries represented by you here, they come close to some of the countries of the G20. They really have important economies if you take their GDP, so they're not so small at all. Take Switzerland, take Austria, take Sweden, take the Netherlands. They are comparable to some of the countries in the G20 group, so it's that's quite an interesting item. So after all, the small countries are not so small, even if they only have 8 million inhabitants in the case of Switzerland.
In Finland, we consider that the number one in education, it's really the teachers. You cannot have a good educational system if you don't have good teachers. And like the ambassador of Singapore said, it means that the teachers have to be paid correctly. They have to be respected. And that has made our system very efficient.
But what I would like to point out is that in the first 20 years of our independence, as I said, the education system was excellent, the research and scientific infrastructure was excellent, the percentage of GDP that we put into it was among the highest in Europe. Where we kind of lagged behind was the link between the universities and the scientific community with the businesses. So there was a lack of link and a mismatch between the needs of the labor market and what was the output of the universities. Too many social sciences students, too few engineers and vocationally trained. So for example, when we hit the crisis in 2008, 2009, we had on one hand a situation of a big increase in unemployment of highly educated young people, but at the same time factories couldn't find workers that had vocational training because the government neglected the vocational training system, which had been in place before for decades.
Number two is what you mentioned, education, of course. And it is not only university education. University education, of course, is absolutely important. And there also, what's really important is the link between science and enterprises. We have in Germany these institutes like Max Planck, like Helmholtz, like Fraunhofer institutes, who often do not need state finance anymore. They're financed by the German industry. And what they're doing is really research. That is the link between the universities and the firms, so that what is really investigated at universities does not stay in some ivory tower, but that it is applied at enterprise level. This knowledge spills over to the economy. I think this is another aspect. And of course the aspect of vocational training. If you go to a mechanic's office in Germany, you often find that he's very, very proud, and he will have his diploma on the wall, Meisterbrief in German, Mechaniker of a mechanic's office. He's very proud, as proud of his profession as any economist or lawyer or doctor.
I think to a large extent it's funding of research and development by companies. Switzerland spent 16 billion on research and development. Of this, 3/4 has been spent by companies. So the state basically finances basic research, whereas all the applied research, the more practical research is financed directly through the companies, and the state just creates the environment that can facilitate research and development by companies. So to a very large extent, innovation in Switzerland is carried by the companies and the private sector.
Egypt has got I mean, despite of what you say, but you've got a fairly educated workforce. Your education is far better than our own situation. So if you want to invest and you want a ready-made workforce, Egypt is the destination.
And one of the things I think we did in these periods is really to focus more on the SMEs, because a part of the problems we were facing was due to the financial institutions in Portugal, but especially in the banking sector. As you mentioned, we are still restructuring our banking system. And of course, one of the things we noticed was that these SMEs, they had a lot of problems to get credit. And of course, if there is no credit, so it's very difficult for the companies to grow and to invest more. So this was one of the main things that the government was trying to do with the help of the financial and the European institutions, to provide more capital to the economy, to the SMEs, to the Portuguese companies.
Because so much of our growth and our employment comes from small businesses. So having an environment where it's very easy to do business is very positive.
Today, for instance, in India, the MSME sector, which is the micro, small and medium enterprises sector, is one that takes up the largest chunk of our labor force. This has got to be extremely adaptable, flexible, innovative.
And we know how the young today thinks. The title of this panel speaks, how they see the priorities, the development, smart, innovative, sustainable, green. And this is, I think, if you would look at the developmental strategies of our countries, this is, I think, in the forefront of all of them.
The objective is to provide skills for the jobs of tomorrow, because the world is changing so dramatically. Technology is having shorter shelf life. So you've got to anticipate and work for the future and prepare people for that future that they will actually be working in.
I think if we go back to the 1970s, 1980s, I suspect New Zealand would actually be ranked somewhere near the bottom of this index on ease of doing business. So it's interesting that that countries can change and they can change their positions. By the same token, I think this is one index where it requires constant attention, constant innovation, constant change to remain doing well against it.
And in such context, let me share with you that 3 elements have been systematically present in this process of change. Transparency, zero tolerance of corruption, and more intense and diverse participation of private actors, domestic and international actors in the Mexican markets, to incentive a more intense competition among them, to avoid monopolies, and above all, to benefit the Mexican consumers.
In Singapore, I think he's hit the nail on the head by saying that we do have state-owned enterprises. At the same time, the key is that the state-owned enterprises is run like a private sector. In other words, the government does not interfere in the day-to-day running of the private sector. And if the management of the state-owned enterprise is not able to perform, you can be assured that the board of directors will get rid of the management and put in place a new management.
The macroeconomic environment is basically the result of the principle of transparency and governance that we have instituted in the last few years. Of course, economic institutions like the central bank are basically very much independent. The finance ministry is very much on top, and the macro fundamentals, whether you look at inflation, unemployment, are way below that 2% or staying at that level right now. So basically, it is our program and policy of transparency and good governance that leveled the playing field, that basically made the Philippines a very good business destination and a very good investment destination for everybody.
I think New Zealand is, it's a very egalitarian society, and there is a very, very low tolerance for not only corruption, but very low tolerance for the notion of anybody getting an advantage through, through a privileged position. And this, this goes back to our history. A lot of New Zealand's early immigrants came to New Zealand to get away from very old-fashioned, hierarchical, sort of class nature of their societies in Europe.
Because we have in Denmark what is called a welfare system. We in Denmark pay very high taxes. The more you earn, the more taxes you pay, basically. But you also get a lot in return. You get a lot for those taxes, actually. You get free education, free health care, you have subsidized childcare, the elderly people are being helped, when they have to go to nursery home. And we also are quite good at making sure that when a person gets unemployed, they get unemployment benefits, and they actually have the opportunity to have lifelong education.
It is not by chance that Panama, in the 2016-2017 report of WF, we are ranking number 6 and number 5 in port infrastructure and air transportation infrastructure. So we have been linked to make the best potential of our geographical position, which is our main asset. As other countries in the previous panel indicated, we don't have big natural resources. We are not a big producer of commodities, in agriculture commodities. Our big asset is our geographical position. So how to make the best of that geographical position, linking it to international trade.
But also Egypt is a destination in a way that it's also a gateway to the rest of the Middle East. If you want to create a base there and then move into the world, or move into Europe, or move into Middle East, because once we are here, we are actually beginning to touch the whole Middle East market. So it's important to come here, and especially now, now that you are deregulating your system, you have just floated your currency, I think it creates a possibility to look afresh at Egypt.
What investors really look for, and I tell them, is that there is always an opportunity in a market as large as Egypt, which is linked to the Arab world, to parts of Africa, and even to America, and in certain ways to the US. And I think many of them take advantage of those situations.
And if we look back in the last 20 years or so, Our export to GDP ratio is hovered stubbornly around that 30%. We've found it very, very difficult to shift it. And there are a number of reasons for that. Part of it does go back to actually New Zealand's size. Our firms are small, and when you're small, it's hard to develop economies of scale, but it's also hard to invest in international connections, and that's really what's required.
There are also huge amount of challenges. Some of our companies here face exactly the same kind of problems as other foreign investors in terms of going to several, maybe 30, 40 doors whenever there is a problem. There is no single, although you are moving towards a one-stop destination for investors, I hope there will also be a one-stop center for solving problems. Thank you.
In this very fierce competition, what big investors look for is a certain predictability factor, a certain transparency factor. I think the Singaporean talked of the single window approach, which actually happens. And I think big investors will go once those environmental conditions are there.
We have shortened the days in trying to establish a business from 34 to 8 days only, and reduce the number of steps from 16 to 6. So we are fully aware of the need to make the establishment of business a lot easier in the Philippines.
But that doesn't mean that, I mean, we are today in Singapore, within the government, we are extremely, our number one concern today is the declining openness of trade and global protectionism. And this is our number one, because the last 50, 60 years we have seen the world moving towards a much more open trading system, economic system, but now we are getting more and more concerned that it is becoming more protectionist and much more autarkic in nature. Big countries are now thinking in terms of maybe we should be focusing on our market size, as Ashraf, you correctly pointed out. But smaller countries like us will have to adjust. We take the world as it is and not how we wish it to be. Thank you.
Well, of course, everything that happens in Europe has an impact to Finland also. Even though they are up in the north, we are not isolated. And of course, it's very concerning what has happened, a certain kind of nationalistic approaches that have taken place in Europe and also other globally. And for an economy like Finland, which is based on on exports, on trade, it's not a good thing. But what has happened, it's not the end. We are those who are working on finding the solutions, good solutions to continue open economies, globalization.
To Britain. Britain is 15% of the European Union economy. 15%, the other 85% is the other 27 states. We all hope that we get a good solution. Of course, many people still hope that a solution such as Norway or Switzerland, where Britain somehow would stay within the European economic space, would be the best solution. But this is now up to the British, of course, and we are waiting for the divorce request, in fact, and hope that we will have good negotiations and a good result at the end.
First of all, let me tell you that I cannot agree more with my colleagues saying that free trade is the best recipe in order to promote progress and to combat poverty. And the best possible outcome for us in the near future is to have an updated agreement talking about NAFTA, according to the current economic reality, considering that this treaty was signed more than 20 years ago. So we have new realities and new challenges, and so we are totally open to update this agreement. But considering that NAFTA has been a story of tremendous success, considering not only the outstanding volumes of trade, but the deep integration and interaction that currently exists between Mexico, United States, and Canada. For instance, we trade $1 million every minute the whole year. So that means something very relevant in terms of economic interaction among the three countries.
So much so that in the last 50 years, ASEAN is turning 50 this year, we have built what we could look at as the third most populous country in the world. If ASEAN were a single country, we have the third largest labor force if ASEAN were a single country. And we are, as I stated earlier, we're the 7th largest economy, and by 2050 we will be the 4th largest economy. So it is we're probably, as you said, doing something right, but we're still a work in progress, and we'll never be stopping in our objective.
Because as regional blocs, we compete, and competition is healthy, and it will continue to happen. There are areas in which ECOWAS is better than Southern Africa, is more advanced, the Eastern Bloc is more advanced, and we all want to advance, and we'll continue to compete. But competition needs to be regulated, and competition, the energy that arises out of competition needs to be channeled towards a common good. And the common good is for the integration of the African continent. Then African continent is the richest continent in terms of natural resources. But how do we leverage that as the African continent so that we can speak as one voice when we go to deal with other regional blocs, the AU, for instance, when we deal with China, we deal with the US. If we still continue to speak as individual countries and as small regional groups, we'll always find it difficult to make our voice heard and to bring the economic muscle onto the table when we negotiate and get a better deal for the African continent.
He was promoting this idea of co-petition, which is cooperation among the competition. So I think there's quite a bit of room for cooperation among both of us.